I just recorded a whole part and then accidentally deleted it. Basically, Billy wasn't cooperative. The attorneys argued over because John Parker wanted to play part of an interview, and the state argued every freaking time. The state argued that the defense was not allowed to do that while the state was presenting its side of the case. Whatever. Not a whole lot interesting. They adjourned early so that they could research it and present it to the judge the next day to decide whether or not it would be played. I don't think there was anything else real interesting in that other than the border agents did say that Billy was uncooperative and that the bug that they planted in the car basically didn't produce anything useful because it wasn't set up correctly or it wasn't set up to par, so you couldn't really understand anything. I think that was about it for the end. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and start day 22 here. So, day 22, which would have been Thursday. Yes, Thursday, October the 13th. So starting out day 22, were the arguments about playing the interview that the defense wanted to play. Ultimately, the judge sustained the prosecution's objection and decided not to play the recording of Jake at this time. The state did some clarification on why the bug didn't produce anything useful. The state had expected the family basically to talk to each other after the questioning, after the interviews, but they didn't. And the road noise was so loud every effing time. But the road noise was so loud once they were back on the highway that you couldn't understand anything. Next, the state called BCI agent, special agent Jennifer Comisford, Comisford, to the stand. She was present for much of the investigation, including processing the crime scenes, search warrants, and the interviews at the Canadian border. She said before the interviews, they were given files that contained a variety of documents that they were to ask the members of the Wagner family, including paperwork found in their belongings that they found during the search warrant of their stuff in storage while they were in Alaska. At this point, they were considered suspects, and this was considered a custodial interview. And they were read their Miranda rights, which was I don't know if it was true or not because you can tell, an investigator can tell them whatever they want to hear, that they had to read their Miranda rights as part of the border issues. She was one of the two that interviewed Angela Wagner, and they did play a recording of a 2-hour conversation with her. Go over to part 2. We are on day 22, part 2. So on this day, we still had Jennifer Comisford, I think is how you say her name, on the stand, and they played a 2-hour interview. It's just under 2 hours that they had with Angela Wagner at the border. I listened to the interview. It's a little hard to listen to. Like, the audio is not great, and whatever they were using was sitting way too close to their folders, and anytime they did something, it was so loud, and it would drown out Angela a little bit, but ultimately you could hear most of what she said. They were also using a technique, I forget what it's called, but basically the investigators were acting as though they were on Angela's side and actually kind of talking shit about Hannah Roden, which obviously they don't have an opinion on, but even if they did, she still wouldn't deserve that. But what that does is it allows Angela to feel like she can trust them and open up to them because they feel the same about Hannah being promiscuous and, a spoiled brat and all the things that she said. She did talk about them dating, that she saw Hannah Mae as a daughter, that she was sad when Hannah Mae and Jake broke up. She kept asking about which one when they would talk about Hannah's boyfriends after Jake. And then she also kept referring to the murders as the incident. She did say that Hannah Mae was the love of Jake's life and that prior to Hannah Mae wanting a break from Jake, they were planning a wedding in August of 2015, even going so far as to researching when to plant the sunflowers so that there would be sunflowers and all of the planning that went into that. She talked about Sophia having a hard time, that Sophia had one time insisted that she saw her mother at a campground and that she would call her mom and her Nana Data on her toy phone to talk to them, which is just absolutely heartbreaking. She says that their relationship after the breakup was friendly and that Jake was just over it, but that is pretty well not the truth by anybody's story except for Angela's. At one point, Angela wanted to go out and check on the kids, but the agents that were watching them, they were outside. And this is in a federal building. The federal agents outside were going to take the kids to the cafeteria on the next floor to get something to eat. Angela was not a fan, but allowed it to happen and go to part three. I don't know. Day 22, part 3. So the rest of Angela's interview had some kind of sporadic stuff. She said that Hannah Mae, when she was pregnant with Kylie, she was super sick, so that she would call Jake to come get Sophia more often than usual so that she could sleep or shower. Sophia is a rambunctious child, Angela said, and that she took a lot of energy. That she had only been to Chris Senior's once. And she refused to go back because she said his couch had too much dog hair. The investigators asked her if those dogs were friendly. She said they were fine as long as Chris was there, especially one that's name was Chance. But Jake had been bitten by Chance several times when he turned up at Chris Senior's to look for Hannah. Like, why are you turning up to look for Hannah? Like, what kind of psycho shit is that? So she claims that after Hannah had baby Kylie, but before the murders, obviously, she came to the Wagner home because she wanted them to meet the new baby. Keep in mind, Kylie was 4 days old when her mother was murdered. And assuming that Hannah had a normal, natural, well, I guess not normal, a typical, natural epidural birth, she would have been in the hospital for a day or so. So you're telling me she came over the day before with this baby? They asked Angela how she found out about the murders. She said she found out about them on the news like everybody else. She said all four of them were together. She said she was in the kitchen with the kids and that the other three were in the home. And someone began freaking out. So they all sat down and watched the news. Later, she said Jake wasn't in the house at all. But he had left to do something out on the property, and she had been in the TV room with the children and removed them from the room after seeing the news. After the Wagners saw the news, she said she sent Jake to the hospital so that he could check on Kylie. Which, I mean, I guess at the time, like, Kylie was only 4 days old. Jake was still living in his delusion that this child might be his. Angela pointed out that George's ex-wife Tabitha was bipolar, didn't take her medication. She insinuated and said that Tabitha would probably say bad things about the Wagners, and she started in on Leonard Manley. Now, there is a whole sub-theory that I agree with, that the Wagners were attempting to frame the Manleys for this murder, which is why she bought the Papaw shoes that Leonard Manley owned. Head on over to the next part. I forget which part it is. Sorry, there was a break. I had to deal with a couple things. So we are back with day 22, part 4. So after the pointing the finger at anyone possible, Angela then became frustrated and was more angry about their belongings that had been ruined during the execution of the search warrants. Let's see. She told them that if they had simply asked to search the home and the things that they had in storage, she happily would have unloaded them for them to avoid anything being damaged. She would have put it back in there. She also said that she had talked to Ryan Scheider regularly and speaking with him when he came to their property. And I mean, it's a pretty common thing that people who were involved want to stay really close to the investigation because they want to know what you know. I have not yawned in half an hour. And as soon as I start making these, it starts again. So at this point, it kind of shifts tone for good reason. Um, at this point, they were talking about the custody papers that were drawn up by a lawyer. They showed the paperwork to, now you can't see this because their videos didn't work, but you can hear them. Seriously. They show Angela these paperworks and they ask her, or this paperwork, and ask her if she recognizes it. She said that she didn't remember it. They pointed out that it was notarized by her mother, Rita Newcomb. She was like, would you look at that? I don't remember this. They then pointed out the date at the bottom, not the, when you print like a document, especially like an email or something, there's the date that's on the document, and then down in the corner of the paper is the date that it was printed. You can turn that off. It's a pretty easy setting to turn off. So these people are not as smart as they think they are. The date that this paperwork was printed, it was dated, I believe, Christmas Eve of 2015. And the paperwork was printed off 3 weeks before the murders. And then Angela started saying, well, I might have printed it. I'm not sure. Then he pointed out that this didn't look like a legal document. This looked like something that was typed out on old Microsoft Word, like Windows 98. And she started sounding flustered. And then she said she believed it might be a document that she had printed or typed for Jake or Hannah Mae to take to Jake's attorney. They changed the subject again and let it go with that because they had clearly caught her in a lie there. Go to the next part. D22, part 5. So he then began to ask, this is the investigator Ward, began to ask Angela if she ever bought clothing items. Seriously. The yawning is out of control today. He was asking whether she ever bought clothing items for her son or her husband. She said she would occasionally pick them up something if it was something that she knew they needed or that saw something that they might like. He asked what types of stores. She said that, they liked Bass Pro Shops and that she would usually get their stuff at Walmart, which is where the murder shoes came from. He then specifically asked if she would buy them shoes ever, and she said no, she bought them everything except shoes because they were different sizes. Each shoe fits differently, even though she knew their sizes, which is true. I mean, I know I wear anywhere between an 8 and a 9.5, depending on the shoe. So, okay, I'll give her that, but I mean, she still bought the shoes. So they then showed her the shoes, asked if a picture of the shoes, asked if she recognized them. She said no. They then showed her crime scene photos and pointed out visible in the images several shoe prints and blood that investigators knew belonged to the killers. These are the shoe prints that were admitted a couple weeks ago at the beginning of the trial. They then produced a photo of the Walmart shoes with the tread print that matched. They asked Angela if the shoes looked familiar. She said no, but maybe she'd seen Billy's father wear similar shoes. And then they said, we have a receipt for these shoes purchased by you. She was quiet for a second, and then she responded, okay, well, then I did purchase them. How she didn't get arrested after this interview is baffling to me. They then showed her the image that was captured of her at the Waverly Walmart on April 7th, 2016. During that trip, the receipt they collected shows she bought 2 pairs of the shoes. She then says, are you telling me those are the shoes that were used in the murder? And then she started backpedaling. She then said that she did in fact buy the shoes for Jake and George, but that any shoes that were used in the murder couldn't possibly be the same as those because she'd thrown those shoes in the garbage because the boys didn't like them. They called them old man shoes, and they didn't want those. They wanted sneakers, but not sneakers like those. They asked if she knew when she threw them away. She said no. And then they started bringing up the shell casings. They told her that shell casings that were recovered at Peterson Road were an identical match to shell casings that were found at the crime scenes. Angela replied, there's no way. I'm telling you, there's no way. And over to part 5. Sorry, I misspoke. This is actually day 22, part 6. So, when Angela was presented with the evidence that they had found identical shell casings at the Peterson Road property during a search warrant, she, of course, said there's no way they could possibly be a match. And that she said plenty of people came to their house and shot guns, including Frankie Roden. She also said other people who had hunted with the Wagners had shot in the yard as well, but way to throw a fucking murder victim under the bus, you useless bitch. She, of course, was extremely flustered at this point because she was realizing these investigators had way more than she thought they did. They asked her whether she could tell them why custody documents were printed, shoes with matching prints from the crime scene were purchased, and, just weeks before this happened, or why a murder weapon was fired in her yard. Then she decided to backtrack a little bit, change her story, said she wasn't alone when she was at Walmart, that the whole family had been in the car. Comisford, the female agent, then said that surveillance footage had showed Angela getting into the backseat of a vehicle in the parking lot before it drove away. They continued to press her. She got upset, and at this point, she asked for an attorney, and the interview ended. Next, they called Chris Newcomb, who is Angela's half-brother. He is 20 years younger than her, and they share their mother, Rita. Basically, he would have been born right before Jake and George were, so he grew up with Jake and George, not necessarily his sisters or sister, even though these were technically his nephews. He was asked to describe the Wagner family dynamic, and he said, and Angela's relationship with her sons, and he said, quote unquote, on her part, controlling is all get out. If she'd tell them to jump, they'd jump. I think that's the politest way I can put it, end quote. He called Billy useless and lazy, which I think is hilarious. He said Billy didn't want to do anything productive and was always scheming and running his mouth, which we've seen from the Billy interview, which if you still have not listened to, you need to go back and listen to it. It is so funny. They asked about the relationship with the grandchildren, of course, which is Bullvine and Sophia, to which Chris said that he thinks that Angela tried to be more of a mother than she should have, as she is the child's grandmother, not their mother. So Chris Newcomb had worked for years buying, selling, trading scrap, livestock, anything else that he could make money off of. And he said that about a year or two before the homicides, George had come to him asking him to find him a .40 caliber Glock pistol, which Newcomb did eventually find and set up a Facebook sale for George. He said this wasn't unusual. He'd bought guns off of each other fairly often. Go over to part 7. Day 22, part 7. I'm going to try to speed this up. I actually need to go pick up my kid. So they went through some more testimony from Chris Newcomb. He said that Hannah Mae was like a sister to him. They asked, I'm just going to kind of go through this pretty quick. His interview is interesting if you want to go and watch that one. They asked him if he knew what Jake and George's favorite movie was. And of course he said it's Boondock Saints. And then they brought up when Jake and George dyed their hair darker right before the murders to look more like the brothers in the movie. And to which he said, they just showed up at the house one day and I told him it looks stupid. He said Jake laughed and asked if he looked like Daryl from The Walking Dead, who is played by Norman Reedus and who also played a brother in Boondock Saints, if you're not familiar. And Chris said, no, it looks stupid. He said after the murders, he defended his family until Jake took his plea deal. He said that all changed for him. He said, quote, if I'd have had Jake in front of me at the time, I'd have probably beat him within an inch of his life. He said after he found out about Jake's confession, in hindsight, some things made more sense. Things that investigators questioned him on after the murder seemed odd at the time, but suddenly made sense. And that the whole thing left him feeling enraged, betrayed. I mean, I can only imagine how that would feel with your family. And especially in areas like this and, families like this that are very close, it's going to be hard to view these people as anything other than just your family members. It's going to be hard to look at them as murderers. He said he also thought that the profile picture on George Wagner's Facebook page, which is a wolf missing an eye, was odd and felt kind of wrong, seeing as one of the victims, Kenneth, had been shot once through the eye. They, on cross, they asked how similar Jake and George were to each other, and he said they were night and day. Was picky, adverse to dirt, and more content to sit inside playing video games. And George was more of the hunt, ride four-wheelers, dirt type of thing. They said before you were allowed to get in Jake's truck, you'd have to remove your boots if they were dirty, place them in a bag, and put them in the bed of the truck. He said that once Angela called him from jail, he screamed at her, she screamed at him, and he hung up and blocked the number so that she could never call him again. He said that as kids, things were tense in the home and that the boys often had bruises on them. He suspected that Billy abused them. And then George, when he got bigger, he started defending himself and the abuse became more verbal. He said Jake, on the other hand, would do everything that Angela asked, and George would fight his parents all the time. Go to the last part.